The first light of dawn stretched gently across the red soil plains as Austin stepped out onto the veranda, feeling the familiar warmth rising from the earth even before the sun fully appeared. The cashew trees stood in loose formation across the land, their branches curved like old hands reaching outward, each one heavy with ripening fruit that glowed in hues of yellow and crimson. This was the beginning of harvest season, the most important time of the year, when months of patience finally turned into something tangible. Austin inhaled deeply, catching the faint scent of fermenting cashew apples that had fallen overnight, sweet and slightly sharp, a smell that signaled both abundance and urgency. He had done this for 20 years, yet every harvest carried a quiet tension, a sense that anything could go wrong if care slipped even for a moment. Behind him, the wooden door creaked as Mara stepped out, tying her hair back with a cloth already stained from previous seasons. She did not speak immediately, instead standing beside him and surveying the trees with a practiced eye, as if reading their condition without touching them. The workers would arrive soon, and once they did, the rhythm of the day would take over completely, leaving no space for hesitation or doubt. "They're ready," she said finally, her voice steady but low, as though not to disturb the fragile calm of the morning. Austin nodded, though he already knew, because the trees always spoke first to those who listened. In the distance, a faint rumble of an old truck broke the silence, carrying the first group of workers who had traveled from neighboring villages. Harvest was never a solitary effort, and the land seemed to come alive with people as much as with fruit during this time. Austin walked down the steps and onto the soil, feeling its firmness beneath his boots, grounding him in the work ahead. He bent to pick up a fallen cashew apple, examining its skin, pressing it slightly to test its softness, then twisting the attached nut gently as if rehearsing the motion he would repeat thousands of times in the coming days. Mara followed, already gathering baskets and tools, her movements efficient and unspoken, the kind that only came from years of shared labor. The sun finally broke over the horizon, casting long shadows that stretched between the trees, and in that moment the land transformed from quiet expectancy into a place of action. Voices approached, footsteps multiplied, and the first day of harvest began not with a grand declaration, but with small, deliberate movements that carried the weight of survival, tradition, and hope. The workers spread across the orchard as the sun climbed higher, their movements settling quickly into a rhythm that felt both urgent and unhurried, shaped by years of repetition rather than instruction. Austin walked among them, not as a supervisor who commanded from a distance, but as someone who understood that the harvest depended on attention to detail more than speed, because a careless twist could damage the nut and reduce its value. Each fallen cashew apple was lifted, its attached shell separated with a practiced motion, and then placed into woven baskets that filled gradually with the day's yield. The air grew heavier as the morning advanced, thick with the scent of fruit and soil. And the occasional burst of laughter broke through the steady sounds of work, reminding everyone that even in labor there was space for human connection. Mara moved from group to group, checking the baskets, offering short instructions, and occasionally correcting a hand position with a gentle touch, her authority quiet but undeniable. She noticed everything, from the ripeness of the fruit to the fatigue in a worker's shoulders, and adjusted the pace without ever raising her voice. Near the edge of the orchard, a young worker named Tomas struggled to separate the nut cleanly, his hands still unfamiliar with the delicate force required, and Austin stopped beside him, demonstrating the motion slowly, guiding his fingers until the movement became fluid. The boy nodded, repeating the action with growing confidence, and Austin moved on without praise, because in this place learning was expected, not celebrated. By midday, the baskets had begun to pile near the central clearing, their contents sorted into careful stacks that would later be transported for processing. The sun stood directly overhead, flattening shadows and pressing heat onto every surface, and the workers paused briefly to drink water and eat simple meals they had brought with them. Austin sat beneath one of the older trees, its branches wide enough to offer a patch of shade, and watched the orchard with a gaze that was both proud and cautious. Because a good start did not guarantee a successful harvest. Mara joined him, handing him a piece of bread without a word, and for a moment they shared a silence that spoke of years spent working side by side. In the distance, clouds began to gather faintly along the horizon, barely noticeable but enough to stir a quiet concern in Austin's mind, because weather could change everything in a single afternoon. He finished his meal, stood, and brushed the dust from his hands, signaling the end of rest without needing to call out. The workers rose almost instinctively, returning to their tasks as if pulled back into the flow of the orchard itself. The day pressed forward, each hour marked not by clocks but by the growing weight of filled baskets and the subtle shift in light. And Austin knew that this was only the beginning of a long and demanding season that would test not just their strength, but their ability to endure together. By mid-afternoon, the heat settled over the orchard like a weight that could not be shaken, pressing against skin and slowing even the most practiced hands, yet the work did not stop because the fruit would not wait for comfort. Austin noticed the shift immediately, the slight hesitation in movements, the longer pauses between each basket filled, and he adjusted the flow of work without announcing it, sending smaller groups to the far rows while keeping others closer to the clearing where shade could still be found in fragments. Mara began organizing the collected nuts more carefully, separating those that showed signs of damage from those that would bring a higher price, her fingers moving quickly despite the fatigue that traced faint lines across her face. The orchard, once filled with scattered voices and laughter, grew quieter as the day stretched on, replaced by the repetitive sounds of fruit being lifted, twisted, and dropped into baskets that were now heavier and more difficult to carry. Near the western edge, a sudden gust of wind moved through the trees, shaking loose several ripe cashew apples that fell softly to the ground, and for a moment the workers paused, looking up as if the land itself had shifted its mood. Austin followed their gaze and then turned his attention to the horizon, where the earlier clouds had grown darker and more defined, forming a line that hinted at an approaching storm. He felt the familiar tightening in his chest. Not from fear but from calculation, because rain at this stage could spoil the fallen fruit and complicate the drying process that would follow. Without raising his voice, he began to move more quickly through the orchard, encouraging the workers with brief words and gestures that carried urgency without panic. Tomas, now more confident, worked beside an older man, matching his pace and learning not just the motion but the endurance required to sustain it, and the two exchanged few words, yet their coordination spoke of a shared purpose that went beyond instruction. Mara noticed the sky as well and adjusted her sorting area, covering the filled baskets with cloth to protect them from sudden moisture. Her actions precise and anticipatory rather than reactive. The first distant rumble of thunder rolled across the land, low and uncertain, as if testing whether it would be heard, and several workers glanced toward Austin for direction, their trust in him evident in the way they waited rather than questioned. He nodded once, a small but decisive gesture, and the pace of the harvest increased subtly, each movement becoming more deliberate, more focused, as though the entire orchard had agreed to push forward together. The light began to shift, losing its sharpness and taking on a muted tone that signaled the day was nearing its end sooner than expected, and the air carried a faint coolness that contrasted with the heat that still clung to the ground. Austin knew they could not finish everything before the rain arrived, but he also knew that what they managed to secure now would make the difference between a good harvest and a compromised one. As the wind picked up again, rustling through the curved branches of the cashew trees, the orchard seemed to lean into the coming change, and the workers followed suit, their fatigue momentarily set aside in favor of a shared determination to gather as much as they could before the sky finally broke. The first drops of rain fell without warning, heavy and spaced apart, striking the dry soil with dark marks that spread quickly as if the land itself were absorbing the shock of change, and within moments the scattered impacts became a steady pattern that transformed the orchard into a place of urgency rather than routine. Austin raised his hand, signaling the workers to shift focus immediately, and instead of continuing deeper into the rows, they began gathering the nearest filled baskets, lifting them with renewed strength that came from necessity rather than rest. Mara moved swiftly through the clearing, directing where each load should be placed, her voice calm but firm as she organized the stacking under the temporary shelter near the truck, ensuring that nothing was left exposed to the growing rainfall. The scent of wet earth rose sharply, mixing with the sweetness of the cashew apples and creating a dense, almost overwhelming atmosphere that clung to every breath. Tomas struggled briefly with a basket that had become heavier from dampness, and the older man beside him took one side without a word, their steps uneven but determined as they carried it toward cover. The rain intensified, no longer a pattern of drops but a continuous sheet that blurred the outlines of the trees and softened the ground beneath their feet, making each movement more difficult and each decision more critical. Austin moved through the orchard one last time, scanning for anything left behind, his eyes sharp despite the water that ran across his face, and when he was certain that nothing essential remained exposed, he turned back toward the shelter where the others had gathered. The sound of rain against the metal roof created a steady rhythm that replaced the earlier noises of harvest, and for the first time that day, the workers stood still, their breathing heavy, their clothes soaked, yet their expressions carrying a quiet sense of accomplishment. Mara checked the stacks again, adjusting a covering here, tightening a rope there, her attention to detail unchanged even in the middle of the storm. Austin stood at the edge of the shelter, looking out at the orchard that was now partially hidden behind the curtain of rain, and he calculated what had been lost and what had been saved, understanding that this balance would define the days ahead. The storm showed no sign of passing quickly, and the sky remained dark, pressing low over the land as if determined to hold its place. Some of the workers sat down on overturned baskets, eating what little remained of their meals, while others simply watched the rain, their energy temporarily spent. Tomas leaned back against a wooden post, his hands still moving slightly as if repeating the motions of harvest even in rest, and Austin noticed this with a faint nod, recognizing the beginning of endurance in the boy. Mara finally stepped beside him, her expression thoughtful rather than worried, and she spoke quietly, noting how much they had managed to secure before the rain arrived, her words grounded in observation rather than reassurance. Austin listened, then nodded once, because in this work, acceptance was as important as effort, and no season unfolded exactly as planned. The rain continued to fall, steady and unrelenting, marking the end of the first full day of harvest not with completion, but with interruption, and as the light faded behind the clouds, the orchard remained waiting, holding what was left for another day that would demand just as much from everyone who returned. The rain carried on through the night, steady and unwavering, and by morning the orchard had transformed into a landscape that felt both familiar and altered. The red soil darkened into a deep brown that clung to boots and slowed every step. Austin woke before sunrise, listening to the fading rhythm of water against the roof, and when the sound finally softened into silence, he stepped outside to assess what the storm had left behind. The air was cooler, heavy with moisture, and a thin mist hovered low between the cashew trees, blurring their outlines and muting the colors that had seemed so vivid the day before. Fallen apples lay scattered across the ground, some intact, others already beginning to soften and collapse under the weight of water. And Austin moved carefully among them, lifting a few to judge their condition, knowing that time would now be their greatest enemy. Mara joined him shortly after, her eyes scanning the orchard with the same quiet intensity, and together they walked the rows without speaking, each observation understood without explanation. The workers arrived more slowly that morning, their usual energy tempered by the aftermath of the storm, and when they gathered near the clearing, Austin addressed them briefly, outlining the shift in priorities with a calm precision that left no room for confusion. The focus would be on salvage rather than expansion, on recovering what could still be used before decay set in too deeply. The rhythm of the harvest changed immediately, no longer driven by the steady accumulation of fresh fruit, but by the urgency of selecting what remained viable and discarding what could not be saved. Baskets filled unevenly, some with firm, usable nuts, others with pieces that would never make it to market, and Mara oversaw the sorting with increased scrutiny, her hands moving faster as she separated quality from loss. Tomas worked near the center of the orchard, his movements more confident than the previous day, yet now guided by a new understanding that not all effort led to success, and he watched closely as the older workers made decisions about what to keep and what to leave behind. The ground made every task more difficult, each step requiring balance and patience, and several times a basket slipped or tilted, forcing the workers to adapt without frustration, because there was no time to dwell on mistakes. As the sun gradually broke through the thinning clouds, light returned to the orchard in fragments, illuminating patches of trees while leaving others in shadow, and the warmth began to rise again, accelerating the changes in the fallen fruit. Austin moved continuously, offering brief guidance, adjusting the flow of work, and ensuring that no area was neglected for too long. His awareness stretched across the entire orchard like an unseen net. Mara organized the growing piles near the shelter, creating clear distinctions between what would be processed immediately and what might still require further drying, her system evolving in response to the conditions rather than following any fixed plan. By midday, the weight of loss became more visible, not as a single event, but as an accumulation of small, unavoidable decisions that reduced the total yield, and yet there was also a quiet resilience in the way the workers continued without hesitation. Austin paused briefly at the edge of the clearing, looking out over the orchard that now carried the marks of both effort and disruption, and he understood that this season would not be measured by abundance alone, but by their ability to adapt. Mara stood beside him once more, her presence steady, and together they returned to the work, because the harvest, altered though it was, still demanded everything they could give. The second day after the storm unfolded with a quieter intensity, the kind that did not announce itself through urgency but settled into every movement, shaping the pace of the harvest in subtle but undeniable ways. Austin noticed that the orchard no longer carried the same sense of anticipation as before, and instead it held a deeper focus, as if everyone understood that each action now carried greater consequence. The ground had begun to firm slightly under the returning sun, yet pockets of damp soil remained, catching the unwary and forcing constant attention to balance. Workers spread out once more, but this time their spacing was more deliberate, each person responsible for a defined section, minimizing overlap and ensuring that no viable fruit was overlooked. Mara had reorganized the central clearing overnight, creating a more structured system of sorting and temporary storage, and her adjustments allowed the flow of baskets to move more efficiently despite the reduced yield. The air carried less of the sweet scent from the first day and more of an earthy sharpness, a reminder that time continued to reshape what remained on the ground. Tomas worked steadily, his earlier uncertainty replaced by a quiet determination, and he no longer watched others for guidance at every step, instead trusting his own judgment while remaining aware of the patterns around him. Austin observed this shift without comment, recognizing that growth in this work revealed itself not through words but through consistency. As the morning progressed, the orchard began to regain a sense of rhythm, though it was different from before, less expansive and more concentrated, as if the land itself had narrowed its focus. The workers spoke occasionally, but their conversations were brief, often limited to practical exchanges that supported the task at hand, and even moments of humor carried a restrained tone, shaped by the knowledge of what had been lost. Near the far rows, a cluster of trees that had been left untouched during the storm revealed a small pocket of fruit that had survived in better condition, and Austin redirected part of the team there. His decision quick and precise, ensuring that the opportunity was not wasted. The discovery lifted the mood slightly, not through celebration, but through a renewed sense that the harvest still held value worth pursuing. Mara adjusted her sorting criteria again, recognizing that the overall quality would vary more widely now, and she created an additional category for borderline nuts that might still be processed with extra care. The sun climbed higher, drying the surface of the orchard and bringing back a faint shimmer of heat that hinted at the return of more stable conditions, yet no one allowed themselves to assume that the remainder of the season would be easy. Austin moved through the rows with steady purpose. His attention divided between immediate tasks and the broader progression of the harvest, and he noted how the workers had adapted, their movements more efficient, their decisions quicker, their focus sharpened by experience. By midday, the central clearing held a modest but steady accumulation of sorted nuts, and while it did not match the promise of the first day, it represented something equally important, the ability to recover and continue. Tomas paused briefly to drink water, his hands stained and tired, and as he looked out across the orchard, he no longer saw it as an overwhelming expanse, but as a series of manageable sections, each one contributing to the whole. Mara stood nearby, reviewing the stacks with a critical eye, and when she noticed him watching, she gave a small nod that carried more meaning than any spoken approval. Austin saw this exchange from a distance and allowed himself a moment of quiet acknowledgement, because the strength of the harvest depended not only on the land, but on the people who learned to work within its changing demands. The day moved forward without interruption, steady and controlled, and as the light began its gradual shift toward afternoon, the orchard held a renewed sense of purpose, shaped by resilience rather than expectation. By the third full day after the storm, the orchard had settled into a pattern that felt sustainable, though never easy, and the work carried a steadiness that came from adaptation rather than routine. Austin rose before the others once again, walking the rows alone as the early light stretched across the land, and he noticed how the trees themselves seemed unchanged despite everything, their branches still heavy where fruit remained, their presence constant against the shifting conditions below. The ground had dried further, leaving behind a firm surface broken only by occasional patches of softness, and the fallen apples that had not been collected were now clearly unusable, their forms collapsed into the soil as a quiet reminder of time's limits. When the workers arrived, they moved with less hesitation than before, stepping into their assigned sections with an understanding that no longer required explanation, and the orchard began to fill with the familiar sounds of harvest once more, though now they carried a deeper precision. Mara maintained her structured system in the clearing, refining it with small adjustments that improved efficiency, and her ability to anticipate the flow of work allowed the process to continue without interruption. Baskets arrived in a steady sequence, each one reflecting the varied conditions of the orchard, and she sorted them with a focus that never wavered, her decisions quick and consistent. Tomas had taken on more responsibility within his section, occasionally guiding a newer worker who had joined that morning, and his instructions were simple but effective, mirroring the way Austin had taught him, without excess words or unnecessary correction. Austin observed this from a distance, recognizing the quiet transfer of knowledge that sustained the work beyond any single individual, and he allowed it to continue without interference. The sun rose higher, restoring a sense of normalcy to the day, yet the memory of the storm remained present in the way every worker approached their task, careful not to waste effort, attentive to the condition of each piece of fruit. Near the center rows. A brief moment of tension arose when a stack of filled baskets shifted slightly, threatening to collapse, and two workers reacted immediately, stabilizing the load before any damage occurred, their coordination instinctive and precise. Mara noticed and adjusted the stacking arrangement, reinforcing it to prevent a recurrence, her actions swift and decisive. The rhythm of the orchard strengthened as the hours passed, each movement contributing to a collective flow that no longer felt fragile, but still demanded respect. Austin moved through the rows with measured steps, offering occasional guidance, but more often simply observing, ensuring that the balance between speed and care was maintained. By midday, the clearing held a more substantial accumulation than the previous day, and while it still fell short of the original expectations for the season, it represented a recovery that had seemed uncertain just days before. The workers paused briefly to eat and drink, their conversations slightly more relaxed, though still grounded in the work that lay ahead, and even laughter returned in small, controlled bursts that did not disrupt the overall pace. Tomas sat with the others, listening more than speaking, yet his presence within the group had shifted, no longer that of a learner alone, but of someone who contributed to the shared effort. Mara stood nearby, reviewing the progress with a critical but satisfied expression. And when Austin joined her, they exchanged a brief glance that acknowledged both the challenges they had faced and the stability they had regained. The afternoon continued without incident, the orchard carrying forward with a renewed strength that came not from abundance, but from persistence, and as the light began to soften once again, the harvest moved steadily toward another day's end, shaped by the quiet determination of everyone who remained within it. As the days progressed, the harvest entered a phase where endurance became more important than adjustment, and the orchard settled into a rhythm that no longer shifted dramatically but demanded consistency from everyone involved. The early mornings grew cooler, offering a brief window of relief before the sun rose and reclaimed its intensity, and Austin used this time to walk the perimeter of the land, noting which sections had been fully cleared and which still required attention. The orchard no longer felt vast in the same way it had at the beginning, because its remaining work had become defined, its challenges known, and its uncertainties reduced to manageable risks. The workers arrived with a quiet readiness. Their movements efficient from the moment they stepped onto the soil, and the need for instruction had diminished to occasional corrections rather than continuous guidance. Mara's system in the clearing had evolved into something almost automatic, each category of nuts clearly separated, each stack placed with intention, and the flow of baskets moved through her hands with a precision that left no room for confusion. Tomas had grown into his role fully, no longer measuring his actions against others, but contributing to the pace of the group with a steady reliability that did not draw attention to itself. Austin noticed that the orchard now carried a different kind of sound, less scattered and more unified. As if each movement was part of a larger pattern that had finally settled into place. The sun climbed steadily, and with it came the familiar heat, though it felt less oppressive now that the ground had dried completely and the air no longer held the heavy moisture of the storm. Near the far edge of the orchard, a section that had been left until later revealed the final cluster of trees still bearing a significant number of usable fruits, and Austin directed a portion of the team there, knowing that this would likely be one of the last major efforts of the season. The workers approached the area with renewed focus, understanding that the end of the harvest was beginning to take shape. Not as a sudden conclusion, but as a gradual narrowing of tasks. Mara adjusted her sorting once again, preparing for the final influx, and she created additional space in the clearing, anticipating the shift from collection to consolidation. The day moved forward with a steady confidence, each basket filled and carried with a sense of purpose that came from knowing the work was nearing completion. There were fewer moments of hesitation, fewer corrections needed, and the orchard itself seemed to respond to this stability, its presence calm and unchanging as the final stages unfolded. By midday, the clearing held one of the most balanced accumulations of the entire season, not the largest, but the most consistent in quality, and this brought a quiet satisfaction that did not need to be spoken aloud. Austin stood at the edge of the rows, watching as the workers moved through the final sections, and he understood that what remained now was not just the physical act of harvesting, but the careful completion of everything they had begun. Tomas worked alongside the others without pause, his movements fully integrated into the rhythm of the orchard, and when a newer worker struggled, he offered guidance with the same calm clarity he had once received. Mara observed the process from the clearing, her attention still sharp, but her posture slightly more relaxed, as if she could finally allow herself to see the shape of the finished work forming in front of her. The afternoon carried on without disruption, the light gradually softening, and the orchard, once filled with uncertainty, now held a steady sense of closure, each step bringing them closer to the end of a season that had tested and strengthened them in equal measure. The final phase of the harvest arrived without announcement, revealed instead through the absence of what had once filled every corner of the orchard, and Austin recognized it in the widening spaces between tasks, in the shorter distances workers needed to travel, and in the way the day no longer felt crowded with urgency. The remaining trees stood lighter now, their branches relieved of most of their weight, and the ground beneath them showed fewer signs of fallen fruit, as if the land itself had begun to rest. The workers gathered in the morning with a different kind of energy, not the anticipation of beginning, nor the pressure of recovery, but the steady focus of finishing what had already been shaped by weeks of effort. Austin divided the last sections with careful attention, ensuring that nothing would be overlooked, and the teams moved out with quiet efficiency, their steps confident and their movements precise. Mara had shifted her focus almost entirely to consolidation, organizing the accumulated nuts into final categories, checking each stack with a thoroughness that left no room for error, and preparing them for transport beyond the orchard. The clearing, once a place of constant motion, now held a more ordered stillness, its structure complete, its purpose nearing fulfillment. Tomas worked near the final rows, his hands moving with practiced ease, and he no longer needed to think through each action. Because the rhythm had become part of him, guiding each motion without hesitation. The sun rose higher, casting a clear and steady light across the orchard, and for the first time since the beginning of the season, there was no sense of interruption or uncertainty, only the continuation of a process that had found its balance. Near midday, a small group finished their assigned section and returned to the clearing earlier than expected, their baskets lighter than those of previous days, and this became the first clear sign that the harvest was nearing its end. Austin acknowledged their return with a nod and redirected them to assist in the remaining areas, ensuring that the final work would be completed with the same care as the first. Mara inspected the latest arrivals, her hands moving more slowly now, not from fatigue, but from the need for precision in these last stages, and she adjusted the arrangement of the stacks to prepare for loading. The workers spoke more freely as the day progressed, their conversations carrying a sense of relief that had been absent before, and even their laughter returned with a fuller tone, no longer restrained by the weight of uncertainty. Austin moved through the orchard one last time, walking the rows that had defined the season, and he observed not just the work that had been done, but the way it had been done, the coordination, the resilience, the quiet understanding that had grown among the people who shared this effort. When he returned to the clearing, the final baskets were being set down, and Mara was completing her last checks, her expression focused but calm. The remaining tasks shifted from gathering to preparing, from effort to completion, and the orchard began to empty of activity as the workers brought everything toward the center. Tomas carried one of the last baskets, placing it carefully among the others, and as he stepped back, he looked across the clearing with a sense of recognition, understanding that he had become part of something larger than a single season. The light of the afternoon softened, casting long shadows once more, echoing the beginning of the harvest, yet now those shadows fell across a place that had been transformed by work. Austin stood beside Mara, both of them looking over the final arrangement, and though neither spoke, the shared silence carried a quiet acknowledgement that the harvest, with all its challenges and changes, had reached its conclusion. The morning after the final collection felt different from any other, not because the land had changed, but because the work that once defined every movement had come to a natural pause, and the orchard stood in a quiet stillness that seemed to hold the memory of everything that had taken place. Austin stepped out onto the veranda as he always did, yet there was no immediate urgency guiding his steps, no need to measure the day against the tasks ahead, and for the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to stand still and simply observe. The cashew trees remained where they had always been, their curved branches now lighter, their colors more subdued without the weight of ripe fruit. And the ground beneath them showed only faint traces of what had been gathered and what had been left behind. Mara joined him shortly after, her movements unhurried, her hands free of baskets and tools, and together they looked out over the orchard with a shared understanding that needed no words. The workers would arrive once more, not to harvest, but to load and transport the final yield, and the day would carry a different kind of purpose, one that marked transition rather than continuation. When the truck's distant rumble returned, it no longer signaled the beginning of labor, but the closing of a cycle, and the workers stepped onto the land with a lighter presence, their conversations more open, their movements less constrained by the demands of precision. The clearing, once filled with constant motion, now held neatly arranged stacks that reflected the entirety of the season's effort, each one a result of countless small decisions made under changing conditions. Mara directed the loading with the same care she had shown throughout the harvest, ensuring that nothing was mishandled even at this final stage, and the workers responded with a steady coordination that came from habit as much as from respect for the work they had completed. Austin assisted where needed, but more often he watched, his attention no longer stretched across the orchard, but focused on the conclusion of what had been built over time. Tomas moved among the others with a quiet confidence, lifting and placing with the same measured control he had learned, and when the last of the baskets was secured, he stepped back with the rest, his role fulfilled without the need for recognition. The truck stood ready, its weight now carrying the result of weeks of labor, and as it prepared to leave, the workers gathered briefly, not for ceremony, but for acknowledgement, their presence enough to mark the end. Austin looked across the group, seeing not just individuals, but the shared effort that had carried them through uncertainty and change, and he gave a small nod that served as both thanks and farewell for the season. Mara stood beside him. Her expression calm, her focus already beginning to shift toward what would come next, because the land did not remain still for long, even when the harvest ended. The truck pulled away slowly, its movement steady, and as it disappeared along the road, the orchard returned to its quiet state, no longer filled with voices and motion, but not empty either, because it held the imprint of everything that had taken place. The workers began to leave one by one, their footsteps fading into the distance, until only Austin and Mara remained, standing where the clearing met the rows of trees. The sun rose higher, casting its familiar light across the land, and though the season had ended, the cycle it belonged to continued, waiting to begin again in its own time. Austin turned back toward the house, Mara beside him, and together they stepped away from the orchard, not as an end, but as a pause between one harvest and the next.